Good morning. Today we have an excerpt from a letter from Thomas Jefferson on the 14th of June, 1807, when he was sitting in the White House, to one John Norvell. I'm sorry I didn't have time to figure out who John Norvell was, but the subject is fake news.
Oh.
And he's evidently replying to Norvell. His letter reads as follows. To your request of my opinion of the manner in which a newspaper should be conducted so as to be most useful, I should answer by restraining it to true facts and sound principles only. Yet I fear such a paper would find few subscribers. It is a melancholy truth that a suppression of the press could not more completely deprive the nation of its benefits than is done by its abandoned prostitution to falsehood. Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. The real extent of this state of misinformation is known only to those who are in situations to confront facts within their knowledge of the lies of the day. I really look with commiseration over the great body of my fellow citizens who, reading newspapers, live and die in the belief that they have known something of what has been passing in the world of their time, whereas the accounts they have read in newspapers are just as true a history of any other period of the world as of the present, except that the real names of the day are affixed to their fables. General facts may indeed be collected from them, such as that Europe is now at war, that Bonaparte has been a successful warrior, that he has subjected a great portion of Europe to his will, etc., etc. But no details can be relied on. I will add that the man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, inasmuch as he who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors. He who reads nothing will still learn the great facts, and the details are all false. Perhaps an editor might begin a reformation in some such way as this. Divide his paper into 4 chapters, heading the first, truths, the second, probability, the third, possibilities, and the fourth, lies. The first chapter would be very short, as it would contain little more than authentic papers and information from such sources as the editor would be willing to risk his own reputation for their truth. The second would contain what, from a mature consideration of all circumstances, his judgment should conclude to be probably true. This, however, should rather contain too little than too much. The third and fourth should be professedly for those readers who would rather have lies for their money than the blank paper they would occupy.
Oh.
And that's what he said.
Thank you.
It's a little long, but I don't want to edit Jefferson, so I just read it fast.
Thank you, Al. A timely reading there, very entertaining and humorous. And my takeaway from that reading is our leaders of the past spoke much more eloquently about fake news than our leaders of the present. Thank you, Al. Portland has been the epicenter for protest, frustration, and pleas for police reform for many months now. Sam Harrell is a member of the Portland chapter of Critical Resistance, an organization that believes in care, not cops, and believe that mental health should be guided by the community and not by law enforcement. Sam is a doctoral student studying the relationship between social work and transformative justice. A warm HTP welcome with many smiles and hand waves for Sam Harrell.
I have a presentation that I'll share with you all to just talk through a little bit about critical resistance, our conceptualization of the prison industrial complex, to sort of talk about the scope that we work at, which is beyond just prisons as a physical structure, and what abolition means to us and what our strategy looks like, and some of the work that we're doing. Was that coming from a low-income white family in the Midwest, I was always really confused by and intrigued that no matter how many times we went to jail, we kept calling police. Like my family never had necessarily an adversarial relationship with cops, but we certainly weren't helped by them. So that got me really curious about this system and wanting to learn more about it. And then in the Midwest, I ended up working in social work, including child welfare and prison and jail reentry, working on various prisoner support projects, and that brought me here to Portland last year. Okay, so let me get into this. So again, here's what I'm gonna sort of go over today, and then definitely time for questions at the end. Okay, so critical resistance, as many folks may know already, but just to give an overview, we're a national abolitionist organization. We were founded in 1998 by a lot of big players now that people are familiar with, like Angela Davis, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Rachel Herzing, and Dylan Rodriguez are some of our founders. It's a national organization, but it has chapters. So we have 4 chapters: Portland, New York, Oakland, and Los Angeles right now. So very small paid staff, mostly volunteer grassroots organizing. And the goal behind the organization is explicitly to abolish the prison industrial complex. So a set of related interests that support the policing, surveillance, and imprisonment of people. And the logic or the assumption that we operate under is that the system isn't broken, that it's designed exactly, it's working exactly as it was designed. So we sort of insist on this long phrase, the prison industrial complex, instead of just talking about prisons or policing. And it's a mouthful, so we shorten it to the PIC. But when we talk about that, we're talking about the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So we use this concentric circle exercise to sort of talk about or think through what the prison industrial complex looks like. So we start with a set of interests who benefits from this complex structure. So we talk about police unions, governments, private prison companies, politicians, developers, banks, law enforcement, prosecuting attorneys, and different kinds of prison industries as some of the beneficiaries of the prison industrial complex. And then we think about who is empowered by these forces, or what empowers these forces. So what fuels them? So we think about racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, capitalism. So there's a video in here that we may or may not get to, depending on how good my computer works, but it talks about the origins of modern US policing and how that looked a little different in different parts of the country. And some people might be familiar with this from some popular books. But in the South, a lot of historians trace policing in particular to slave patrols. In the North, they trace it to union busting. And in the West, they trace it to keeping indigenous communities out of new white settler towns. So in addition to thinking about the forces today that sort of hold up the system, that prisons and policing are embedded with sexism and homophobia and transphobia, we also see it in like the very roots of the system, which is why we go back to the assumption that we work with, that the system is working as it was designed. And then the tools, this is where we really span beyond just prisons and policing. So the prison industrial complex uses prisons and policing, but also various technologies for surveillance, courts, media, militarization, and different tools of social control. And I have a few examples that we'll go through. And they do all of this as a response to problems that they're not designed to actually fix. And in a lot of ways, they perpetuate, like poverty, homelessness, joblessness, drug addiction, violence and abuse, and mental illness. And we know that the PIC disproportionately affects people of color, young people, queer people, poor people, immigrants, and political dissenters. And it produces a host of results that only further marginalize people, breaking up families, economic insecurity, education, lack of resources by diverting millions of dollars to policing and prisons, billions of dollars. We disinvest in public resources like education, health, recreation, and housing. We know that it further embeds inequity in our society as well as racism, and that in and of itself, all of these interventions are violent. So the few instances where we are actually responding to violence, because the vast majority of people policed and surveilled have not done something violent, when we are responding to violence, the PIC is a violent intervention to begin with, so it exacerbates that issue. So to take a look at a few specific, just a few specific manifestations, I thought I'd give a couple examples. So the first one is incarceration, and I thought this would be an important one to talk about because it's decarceration. So shrinking the size of prisons has become a somewhat bipartisan issue in the past several years. We even see Trump passing some incarceration reform measures. But what a lot of people, including Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow, wants us to look out for are measures and reforms that seem like they're shrinking the size of prisons, but at the same time are growing surveillance and policing in different ways. So incarceration is a great example of that. So incarceration is the use of technology to imprison people. So you might think about like having an electronic bracelet on you during house arrest. A lot of politicians, communities, states are looking at this as a major alternative of how to deal with the size of prisons right now. So moving people out of prisons and into house arrest and electronic monitoring in their homes. And one of the many benefits of this from the state's perspective is that it shifts the cost from the state to the person, because most people on house arrest and who are being electronically monitored have to pay for that themselves. So they pay like a daily or weekly fee for having the bracelet on or whatever other kind of technology they're using. But Michelle Alexander and a lot of brilliant scholars, warn us that this is further creating open air prisons. It's bringing surveillance into the home, and it's not actually addressing the root concern. That so many people are being surveilled in our country. And then there are, like every part of the prison industrial complex, there are private corporations that are behind this and are benefiting, including ones like Geo Group, which is a major private prison corporation that already has its hands in existing prison projects. Child welfare is an area of the PIC that I spend probably most of my time thinking about, again, because my background is in social work. And a lot of people wouldn't consider this an inherently carceral system or something that is rooted in surveillance. But child welfare is a fairly unique structure in that it's one of the only ways that we can actually go into homes, interrogate families, search houses without a warrant. People can say no, and then a DCS worker can bring a cop, get a warrant, and come back. When people are suspected of child abuse, they are entered into a system of multi-system surveillance. So people are surveilled by the police and child welfare, and then they have access to a range of data systems, including ones that have to do with just regular welfare. So we know that people who, for example, get food stamps are more likely to be identified by Department of Child Services because they have their data already. So if they have just a little bit of a clue with a reporting call that someone might be experiencing abuse, if they can cross-reference that information in a welfare database, then they're more likely to find them and then investigate them. Racial disproportionality has been a problem forever. So we see the same trends in what races and ethnicities are policed and imprisoned as we do in child welfare. We know that Black children, that at this point, 1 in 2 Black children in the US will be investigated by the Department of Child Services, and 1 in 3 children total will be investigated by the Department of Child Services. And then it's this sort of insidious combination of care and control, because whenever you are investigated for child abuse, you do sometimes get access to a range of services that you might not have gotten before, but it's with a price. If you don't comply with those services, you can certainly lose custody of your children. And then treatment centers, this is one that recently Maya Shenwar and Victoria Law have written a really great book about, called Prison by Any Other Name, that includes a chapter on treatment centers. But we still have, this is just to say that we still have psychiatric hospitals today. A lot of people think that when deinstitutionalization happened, those sort of went away. But there are still, let's see if I can find my numbers. There's still 35,000 people in psychiatric hospitals today. And 5,000 people are indefinitely civilly committed. So civil commitment is a term that can be used for different things, but one way that civil commitment can be used is a sentence, and it's a sentence that people get after they've already completed a prison sentence. So somebody who is considered still dangerous, or somebody who has a serious sex offense, can be sentenced to a treatment center indefinitely and have sort of no out date. And there are thousands of people in the country that have this situation. So that's one way that we see treatment centers, mental health and psychiatric treatment, sort of used in conjunction with or conflated with prisons. The other one is drug courts and drug treatment centers. And I've worked some with this in my case management experience. But one sort of progressive seeming development in criminal justice has been the development of different alternative courts, like drug courts. But what a lot of people don't know is that to participate in a drug court, which is an alternative sentencing program that comes with case management and classes and support groups, people have to plead guilty. So they might not have done that otherwise, but to get into these programs, they often have to plead guilty first. And then they get into this array of services and stipulations. So people with addictions who have been sentenced to drug court have to get regular drug tests, regular court appearances, often mandatory participation and treatment, attend classes and support groups. But failure to comply with those, similar to like failure to comply with probation or parole stipulations, can result in a heavier sentence. So on average, people who violate their drug court conditions are sentenced to 74 months in prison on average. So what I saw, at least in the Midwest, working with drug courts and people in drug courts, is that I never recommended it because it seemed nice on the surface, but if people messed up, usually having to do with not being able to comply with mandatory treatment requirements, then they would just end up with a worse sentence and end up going straight to the state prison instead of the jail. So these are a couple ways that we see this idea of treatment, again, being wielded or manifesting into incarceration. And the last sort of piece, just to touch on as an example, is calls and mail. And this one is pretty personal to me, both with my family and because at Critical Resistance, I work with the Prisoner Correspondence Program, so our mail program. But I think a lot of people are familiar with that private prison companies control most of the phone calls and the e-messaging that happens in prisons. So there's a few vendors. There's actually two main ones that have swallowed and monopolized all the other ones to control the phone communications. In prisons, we know that people pay sometimes around $1 a minute for phone calls. But what I think is more of an issue even is the electronic messaging systems, because those have started to replace visits. And I have seen this in some of the prisons where I have loved ones in Indiana. So in the past 5 to 10 years, a lot of prisons have replaced regular email that prisoners can use with tablets that they have to buy. So people in prison have to physically buy like an iPad kind of tablet. So that costs a lot of money. That's not given like a subsidy. So like they can cost over $100, which when in prison, whenever you're paid, 25 cents an hour for work, that's a really hard thing to afford. So they first buy the tablet and then they have to pay per message. So you're paying for your email or paying for video visits. So a lot of prisons have just gotten rid of visits altogether and are requiring video visits, which then cost money, which is a big deal because regular visits didn't cost money. And then that considers that they work and that families have access to that technology. So the system of video visitation and video messages and also text messages are run by private companies who are, one, charging an exorbitant amount for those messaging capabilities, but are also giving kickbacks to some prisons and some state prisons, state and private. There has been a little bit of progress with this from the Federal Communications Commission, but not a lot. It's still overly priced. Nationally right now, the average cost of a 15-minute call to a jail, for example, is almost $6. And then mail is something that I spend a lot of time working on, like I said, and we're seeing a couple similar trends with mail. So for example, Pennsylvania is doing what I think more and more states are going to start doing, where they've contracted with a private company in Florida. So whenever you write someone in prison in Pennsylvania, your letter gets redirected to Florida to a private corporation, and that corporation scans the letter, makes a photocopy, shreds the original, whether it's a birthday card, legal paperwork, just a handwritten letter, etc. They shred your original, they scan the photocopy, they enter that into a searchable database for surveillance, and then they mail the photocopy to the Pennsylvania prison. So people inside are only getting photocopies of what you've sent them, and now they're all digitized in a scannable system from this private corporation in Florida. Indiana, where I'm from, has done a very similar thing, but instead of rerouting it to a private corporation, they're just scanning it themselves right now, which means that like my brother will never get a physical card from me. He'll only ever get a photocopy of a card, which is frustrating. With that, we also saw, for example, in Pennsylvania, whenever they started contracting with that company, they also banned all books, all physical books, even from store vendors, not just books to prisoner projects. And that's so that they can require people to buy ebooks on those tablets for $3 to $25. So again, another way to monopolize communications in prison and then to profit at every step. So that's been a really big hit to books to prisoners projects, which I've worked with for a long time in Pennsylvania, and we're sort of bracing for that in other states across the country. So with all of that said, what is critical resistance sort of goal? There's a lot of momentum around defunding police right now, which is something that critical resistance has been working on for a long time, but our vision is broader than that. So our vision is abolition, which has the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So we are not just into the idea or interested in sort of the dismantling or the tearing down, but also the building up. We see abolition as both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. There's a video here, but I'm gonna just skip it. So our strategy is threefold. And if anyone's ever been to any of the activities at the Dismantle, Change, Build Center, then these words or the strategy might be familiar to you. But critical resistance strategy is first to dismantle. So dismantle different parts of the prison industrial complex, caging, policing, practices and larger systems that harm and control communities. To change how we relate to each other, to change common sense, to change how we allocate resources, and to build new practices, new skills, new relationships. So some examples of these, so for dismantle, Care Not Cops, which is a program that CR is involved in, has been pushing for years to defund the Portland Police Bureau, including specific targets like the Gun Violence Reduction Task Force. We definitely got some huge wins, as people saw. There was some significant defunding, some dissolvement of different programs like the TriMet police, the school resource officers, but Care Not Cops is still asking for more defunding. They did not defund at the level that a lot of community activists were hoping for. Another example would be no new jail campaigns, which a lot of our critical resistance chapters have been working on in other cities, is trying to prevent the opening of new jails, improved jails. For change, an example might be a transformative justice, which I'll touch on at the end. And for build, a couple things that we're doing here right now in Portland is our inside-outside organizing through prisoner correspondence programs. So through our monthly mail program, people build relationships across walls. One this summer that gave me a lot of hope was that one of our volunteers was writing somebody in the county jail through our program, and was able to learn about a hunger strike that was happening in the county jail, and then organized a ton of outside support to give resources to the hunger strike, put pressure on the county to listen to the demands. Another example is the Oakland Power Project out of our Oakland chapter, which has done things like started a community garden, developed an anti-policing health toolkit, so workshops for healthcare workers, and also developed emergency preparedness trainings to equip communities to replace or not rely on 911. Whenever we are looking at reforms and deciding as an organization whether or not we support them from an abolitionist perspective, these are some of the questions that we ask. So we ask, does a reform, does a tactic reduce funding to the prison industrial complex? Does it reduce the tools, tactics, and technologies at its disposal? Does it reduce the scale? And does it challenge the notion that the prison industrial complex creates safety or increases safety? So some examples of reforms that critical resistance would support are reducing the size of police, ending police militarization programs, and abolishing paid leave for cops under investigation. Some examples of reforms that we would not support because we would see them as doing answering no to one of these questions and increasing the scope and the tools of the prison industrial complex would be reforms like body cameras, because there's a range of issues with body cameras, but one of the key ones is that it is adding a tool of surveillance to police, and it is not statistically showing that it's reducing overall the power and the harm of police. But now cops selectively have the ability to add a camera to situations that can then be used to indict citizens. Another example of a reform we wouldn't support would be any kind of like therapeutic or gender responsive type jail program. So a lot of liberal reforms often include ways to make our jails and prisons better. And that's a tough one. We ask ourselves, is it making jails more sustainable long-term? Is it increasing their size and their ability to incarcerate or hold more people? So like, for example, the jail in the community where I used to live was constantly being sued by ACLU because it was overcrowded and people were sleeping on the floor and on mats. So a lot of people wanted to just build a bigger jail so that it could hold people. And that would be a reform that would increase the size and capacity of the jail to keep imprisoning people. So an abolitionist reform would be saying, no, we just need to not be imprisoning so many people. We need to reduce the amount of people in the jail, as opposed to like, making that jail better or bigger. And then before I sort of end with what sort of critical resistance is working on right now, I just wanted to touch on transformative justice as a highlight of that change strategy, that dismantle, change, build. So changing the way that we relate to each other and changing the way we respond to harm. So when we think about accountability systems in our society, the three sort of models that we can think about are retribution, restoration, and transformation. So retribution is what we have right now. And it says if you did a bad thing, then you're a bad person and you should be punished. And that's the system that we mostly operate under with jails and prisons. Restorative justice says, oh, okay, you did a bad thing, but you're not a bad person necessarily, and you can make up for it by giving back to the person you harmed. In some jails, in some county programs, some state programs are trying to incorporate restorative justice and are really misappropriating indigenous practices around restorative justice and doing things like, in the last community I worked with, there was a restorative justice program for shoplifting that was really weird. People had to like write an apology letter to the corporation they stole from. There was no regard for why someone took something for what they needed. The idea was that a corporation was harmed. You know, if like a mom stole a bottle of formula, or yeah. So restorative justice, it can be done right or it can be misappropriated, but ultimately it's about a person doing harm and trying to repair harm. Transformative justice, which is what a lot of abolitionists believe in and work towards, says that, okay, you may have harmed somebody, but you didn't do that in a vacuum, right? You don't exist alone. You exist in a community. So in addition to asking what you can do to make this right, we're also going to ask what conditions the community created that made it possible for you to do that harm, and how the community around you supported those conditions and what they can do to change too. So we're not just going to look at or ask an individual person to repair harm. We're also going to ask the broader community to help with repairing harm and to help with changing the conditions that made that harm possible. There's been some great success with transformative justice, specifically in child sexual abuse. And I think that's really notable because a lot of times when we talk about reform with jails and prisons, child sexual abuse is the thing that we don't talk about because it seems the hardest, it seems the scariest. And it's also something that people that are opposed to abolition, that are opposed to decreasing the size of jails and prisons will always throw out there. Like, well, what are you going to do with the people that sexually harm children? But I think it's important to know that some of the biggest resources and the biggest advocates for transformative justice are explicitly child sexual abuse survivors who have come out and saying that the system that we have now is so punitive that our families would never use it. It's so punitive that I would never use it when I needed it. Because one, it doesn't work. Most of the time for serious harms like that, people aren't believed anyway, and the system doesn't hold them accountable. But when it does work, the survivors are set aside because in our criminal justice system, whenever someone commits a serious violent crime, it's not the person who harmed them versus the person they harmed. It's the person who harmed them versus the state. So the survivor isn't actually a party to the case. They don't actually have a right to be involved in or to direct a criminal case, direct the direction of it or what happens. So when it does work, it works through punishment without necessarily the voice of the survivor involved. So transformative justice offers a different model where when someone commits a serious harm, our first priority is to keep the the person who was harmed safe and to ask what they need. But when we're talking about accountability, we're not talking about accountability to the state. We're talking about accountability to the community and to the person that was harmed, and what needs to change both personally, interpersonally, and then throughout an entire community with community conditions and norms. So we see it also as offering both intervention and prevention, because communities that rely on transformative justice develop a sort of a norm where if I know that when I've done something wrong, I'm not going to be just thrown behind bars, but instead a community is going to engage me in a process and care about me, that I'm more likely to come forward and ask for help and say, hey, I did a bad thing, because I know that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. So it sort of is a way of addressing that silence, that isolation, that avoidance that we see too often right now with our criminal punishment system. And this is an area, you know, if people have more questions or want more resources, this is specifically an area that I've worked in a lot and would be happy to talk about. So to wrap up, for you or people that you know, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the specific things that we're working on right now. So the first one is our stimulus check information project, and this is what I was up till 4 a.m. doing, and it made me late, and I'm so sorry. But we just found out about 2 weeks ago through some court cases that were settled that people behind bars are eligible for the $1,200 stimulus check, but they have to apply by October 30th. So we have done a huge push in coordinating volunteers to mail over 20,000 people the forms and information on how to get that $1,200. And we also have a hotline set up to help people fill out the forms. So right now we're coordinating volunteers to mail stimulus check forms and information into prisons. That's a very short time limited project. We'll only be doing that for a few more days. We're also doing a campaign called Write Them All, which we are over halfway through, which is a project to send an outreach letter and a flyer about resources, including resources around COVID-19, to everyone in Oregon state prisons. So that's over 14,000 people. We have gotten information to about 8,000 people, but we are still coordinating volunteers to reach out with support, solidarity, and resources to people in Oregon prisons. As some people may know, after COVID happened, visitations were shut down in jails and prisons, volunteer activities were discontinued, and the very, very little contact people had with folks outside has been greatly reduced. So we still feel a very urgent need to get that contact back in to Oregon state prisons. And last, we are still continuing our monthly mail night programs where volunteers come together and reply to letters. Since starting Write Them All, the number of letters we have coming in has skyrocketed. So we are working with hundreds of letters and hundreds of volunteers. It's not a pen pal program. We consider it an open house model. So if a volunteer decides to not keep writing, then we're going to pass that letter on to another volunteer so that people inside who are interested in political education and doing inside-outside abolitionist organizing can keep doing that, even if the person who had been writing them originally doesn't keep writing. So we do have a lot of volunteers that write the same person regularly, but not always. And then here's a lot of places to find us. We are very active on social media. I'm personally not active on social media, so even I miss a lot of stuff that we're doing. But we also have a couple of websites, and you can contact us via email. So I know that was a lot of information just sort of thrown at you. I'm going to stop sharing, and we can open it up to questions or comments or whatever people are thinking around abolition and prisons.
Thank you, Sam, for a very moving and informative presentation. As the MC, I'll start out with the first question today, and others can either type their question and I'll read them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask your question, just type your name in the chat there. So my question is the the structure of critical resistance? Is each chapter, each city kind of on their own program, doing their own things for their community, or is it more of a national push, bringing programs to the local chapters?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the programs are pretty community specific. There's a national structure with both national working groups and staff. There's like 6 paid staff nationally. And then each of the chapters join national meetings on a biweekly basis and work in national working groups, but we decide and define our own programs. So like the Care Not Cops campaign, the Prisoner Correspondence Program, and other things in Portland were things that Portland came up with independently.
Sounds good. Thank you. Our first question is from Dave DiNucci.
Hi. Thanks very much. I mean, that's really interesting and really sounds like positive directions for so much of this. I do wonder, for the same reason I wonder about the the term defunding for police, the term abolishment for these prison systems. I mean, is it true that you'd see no role at all for a prison system that would contain people and who are just a big threat to the community and just need to be put away somewhere? It sounds like, I mean, I think I agree with you that we've definitely overdone it. We've put way too many people into the prison industrial complex than should be there. But I'm just wondering, do you see a reasonable level of prisons that you would accept as needed in a community?
Yeah, absolutely. So the vision is no, and there's a couple different ways that people arrive there or get there. And I think there are various like opinions about how we get there. So I think most of us know and can acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of people in prison have not caused serious harm to other people, right? So we can kind of, I mean, I think a lot of left-leaning people can agree that just prison is not the answer. People don't need to be isolated for things like theft, drug addiction, mental illness, etc. For people that cause serious harm, that's where a lot of our alternative models come in. And I think, you know, when we talk about abolition, we're not talking about if prisons disappeared today, because abolition is also about that build part, which is not just building up resources like housing, education, infrastructure, but also building new ways of relating to each other, inherently addressing capitalism and the ways in which that tears families apart and takes away resources we needed to thrive. So when we think about abolition, we're thinking about also a long-term strategy that fundamentally changes the conditions that lead to most harms, like most serious harms. So if we were to imagine like right now, the transformative justice models we're using right now are models that communities are equipped with, some communities are equipped with to respond to it in the meantime. So there are communities that, for example, have never ever relied on police for serious harms. You know, there are people who, when they're stabbed, stalked, sexually abused, have never called the police to begin with. And that's where a lot of those transformative justice models come from, is they're not like new sort of aspirational ideas. They're things that people have been practicing for a long time. So for example, one example, and I'll put it in the chat, that I find really helpful is Hollow Water, which some people might be familiar with. It's a First Nations community in Canada. They have a documentary that you can watch online about a situation where there were originally just a few children who were being sexually abused by their parents. And the tribe appealed to the state and said, before you sort of take this over and put these parents in prison for a very long time, can we try to use our indigenous processes to address that harm ourselves? And the state agreed. So they started their transformative justice process, which involved years of circle meetings, of therapy, of keeping the kids safe, so keeping them away from the parents for as long as they needed to be, and then addressing intergenerational trauma from boarding schools, and addressing substance use, and addressing key beliefs around sex and sexuality. And then whenever they were working through that program, more and more, not children, but parents who were sexually abusing their children started coming forward. And this is where transformative justice, I think, has the opportunity to create a culture shift that actually keeps people a lot safer than prisons ever would. Because parents in this hollow water community saw that the response was a healing one and a supportive one. So instead of hiding and violence continuing behind the scenes, they came forward and said, we have been harming our children, or we have harmed our children, and we want to engage in a process too. And I think that's important because even with violent crime, our jail system was never designed to lock up all people that do violent crime. It only locks up the people that get caught. And a lot of survivors of violent crime know that most people who committed are never caught and are never catched by the system. So that's just not the system that we can ever imagine being one that continues to respond to harm, because it's not an equal equation. Like, you commit harm and you go to prison. That's a very roundabout answer. There's not a perfect answer, because it's a combination of what we're doing now in small communities and what we think could happen if we addressed things like mental health, housing insecurity, capitalism, et cetera, down the line. So it's a two-part vision. And I think that's where our sort of questions for the reforms that we're supporting to get there along the way come to help guide us. As in the meantime, while we're working on it, what kind of reforms are we going to support? So any reform that decreases the prison system and decreases jail beds in the meantime is one that's going to get us closer to abolition, which is, a practical strategy. It's why, critical resistance has never done like we don't engage in traditional politics. I obviously don't think abolish prisons is like a catchy platform that like the Democratic Party would ever agree to. But it's a political strategy that guides local action for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, we have great minds thinking alike here at HGP because we had very similar questions from Joyce and from Pete. I'll paraphrase the question, and they asked about the Scandinavian prison model, and that was featured in Michael Moore's film, Who Do We Invade Next? Sort of a holistic film about humanity and a different model for prisons. So talk about the Scandinavian model, if you could.
Yeah, I think that so as an organization, that's not sort of something that I think critical resistance would support adopting here, because we're trying to move accountability for harm out of the state's hands and into communities. So thinking about who was actually harmed and how can that be the person or community we're accountable to. I agree that I think some of the points of the Scandinavian model are helpful and are getting us much closer to healing and justice than what we have here, like the holistic approach. I worry that the US would be more likely to take components of the Scandinavian model and fold it into our current system in a way that just makes incarceration more appealing and more therapeutic looking, and sort of combines the therapeutic with the control aspect. So anyway, I think it's definitely a less harmful model, but ultimately critical resistance imagines accountability and healing happening in communities and not under the control of the state.
When you talked about not needing prisons for anybody, you didn't mention people in the category of people I knew who have gone to prison. I haven't seen any of them after they went, but it was purely they went to prison for white collar crime. A group of people perpetrated a fraud which ended up in 1970 to about $200 million, which would be in the billions today. The grand jury investigated, and they were merciful. 23 people were listed as unindicted co-conspirators, but 8 went to jail. And I can't think of anything else to do with them but put them in jail when they do that. What would you do with those guys?
I think my question would be, what can best right the harms that they did? You know, jail, it feels good. It's a retributive response, especially when those same people support or profit off of, you know, the incarceration of millions of people for things like marijuana charges. Like, it feels good to also throw those people behind bars. But in our ideal world, right, if we could get justice, like, does justice look like just disappearing somebody, including white collar crime? Or are there other ways that they can be accountable to the thousands of people that they've exploited and screwed over?
But they didn't have any way to create wealth. That's why they resorted to fraud. And they couldn't, there's no way they're going to create $200 million in wealth to somehow pay back the people they exploited. So, you know, I could say that a fair punishment, a more humane punishment, might be, you know, putting them on in some kind of a public works project or something to make them do hard labor. But it might not involve prison, but it would be very much like a prison-like kind of situation.
Yeah, it's punitive. Yeah, it's punitive. I mean, it's a good example because it's hard. It feels hard to be sympathetic towards. But if I were to apply some of the same questions that I would ask for other people who were incarcerated, I would ask the why questions. You know, when we, like, one exercise that I think is helpful is one called Circles of Crime, where you take a crime, any crime, murder, rape, white collar, embezzlement, whatever, you know, put it in the middle, and then you ask layers of why. So, like, why did that person do that? And then, like you mentioned, like, you know, it's fraud. Like, they don't have resources. You know, it's greed. You know, and so you ask why, and then for whatever answer that they give to that question, you know, like they wanted money. You ask why again, and you ask why again, until you get out to these root causes. And then you bring back the key question of, does punishment and does prison actually address any of these root causes? You know, so I think if I was really invested in addressing why this happened and also how to stop it in the future, then I would do a deep dive at what led somebody to that path and try to address that. Yeah. You know, it's more time, it's more relational, and it's not, it's not as satisfying, for sure.
The prison actually did not work, because one of them went to prison, got out, later became president of a company, and later went back to jail for stealing the employee's pension fund. So obviously the prison didn't do it, but I would hope you might have some other way to think of it.
Yeah. It's not, you know, honestly, it's not a question we get a lot. White collar crime. So it's one I'll bring back to the group for sure. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Sharon. I'll ask Sharon, would you like to come on and ask your question, or would you like me to try and summarize that there? What's going to be best for you?
Oh, I was just saying that I thought that the police should be, well, I think that we're either physical, mental, or emotional beings, and that the people in prison are emotionally diseased, just like I am physically disabled. And to me, when my fellow prisoners, well, I was locked up in Salem with 11 people who claimed to be guilty. They said they wanted to be stopped and to be taught to atone, but they didn't want their lives wrecked. They were therefore resentful of the way the law was enforced. So I believe that they were they were emotionally tortured because they were emotionally diseased which is the equivalent of me being physically tortured because I have multiple sclerosis to make me well again. And I thought police should be emotional doctors, and mentioned that to a policeman who was very much in favor of that.
Mhm. I feel like that's a very relevant point to sort of the question we're having right now of what are police, what's the role of police right now, what was it originally, and what was reasonable for us to ask them to do. And it also makes me think of a question that, you know, whenever a lot of folks in jail, especially in my experience, folks that deal with addiction, oftentimes that I've talked to have some nice things to say about jail. You know, like, or people that are homeless. I directed several homeless shelters in the Midwest, and a lot of people, you know, would say like, at least I have a bed. You know, it's the middle of winter. At least I have somewhere to sleep. You know, at least I've been sober for 6 months. And I think, you know, the few times when some of their basic needs are met by jail, or when they could be met, I think one of our questions back is, if you could have gotten that need met a different way, what would that look like? You know, like, I agree that it's doing this one thing coincidentally, but are there other ways that we could have met that need that didn't involve giving you a criminal record and isolating you and putting you behind bars? And then when I think about the role of police as healers, this is where I think our country has a really serious thing to figure out right now of, are we going to try to change the role of cops to make them nicer, more therapeutic? Are we going to pair them with social workers to give that care control, to further merge that care control capacity, you know, so that we equip people whose job is surveillance and incarceration with people whose job is supposed to be healing and resource allocation and safety? Or are we going to imagine a different response altogether with people who are trained and equipped to and have the resources to heal and to support people? Are we going to have them respond to crises? So I guess I agree that I think some people who are in jail and prison would say that they have emotional, mental, and physical issues. But I don't know that cops reimagined are necessarily the most ideal response to that.
Helen has the question.
I just to kind of continue the discussion of mental illness with and jails. We just have so few beds or programs for people who are suffering from mental illness, and there's such a negative image for, you know, requesting help with mental health. And is your organization addressing that at all? The fact that, you know, to abolish prisons, we need something to fill that void, a void that, I mean, mental health, people should not be in prisons with mental health issues. That's just insanity. But that's where most people with mental health problems are finding themselves, rather than in a program to support their mental health issues.
Yeah, some researchers point out that our jails and prisons are the largest mental health providers in the country, statistically, exactly. And it's actually a really interesting point for the Portland chapter, because Care Not Cops, the Care Not Cops campaign actually was originally called Mental Health Not Cops. And interestingly, Portland, the Portland group ended up changing the name because of how that framing oriented people to abolition. Because what it actually led to was a lot of confusion and a lot of people thinking that our goal was specialized incarceration for mental health people. Like, because there are things like mental health jails, like those exist. The often private companies start them in collaboration with cities. So that's, I just thought that was interesting, because we did have that as a specific campaign, but we changed it. So Portland right now, our chapter has not been working on mental health resources specifically, but other chapters are and have, including the Oakland chapter, has been working on alternative mental health crises responses. But again, I think another part of that defund and divest strategy is let's take a couple million or billion of those dollars and put them into mental health resources, right? It's not like we don't have the money at all. You know, we can put it into prevention and treatment, and also healthcare, better healthcare systems. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating when we have the money and we're just allocating it very, very poorly in ways that states profit. And also, I think Oregon, you know, we've been in the news a lot because of the program in Eugene, the CAHOOTS model. We know that there are alternative crisis response systems for mental health that don't involve police at all, that have a much higher success rate of actually getting people connected to resources than police calls for mental health crises. So, you know, Eugene is a great model that a lot of people are turning to right now that can be expanded. And we've talked about that some in our Portland chapter, but it's not something we've taken on just yet.
Okay, Willie has a comment that you might have a comment on, Sam. She says, aren't there people who are born with no conscience and hurt others? And I guess she'd be asking, how do we handle that population?
Yeah, Willie, I saw you unmiked. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think I'm really asking kind of what Helen asked, but I didn't realize she just said she had a question. So I didn't realize that's what she was going to ask. I'm saying the same thing. There's people with mental illness. What are we going to do with them if we don't have jails?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the vast majority of people with mental illness aren't those folks you're talking about that are born with, I think, what people might say like a psychotic, you know, diagnosis.
Well, I'm talking about white collar crime too.
Yeah.
You know, they don't care how many people they hurt. They just want more money. So aren't there people like that need to be contained somehow?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think the question is, what do we think they need, you know, and what is a true mental health response and system, and what does that look like? And we do know that we have, I mean, we've had responses to mental health crises for a long time, from like ranges of therapeutic interventions. There are treatment centers, there are lockdown ones and non-lockdown ones. So you know, we have a range of sort of options, but I think a lot of people would argue that it's just about investing the money and resources in them.
I'm saying there's people who have had PET scans or whatever you call it, and there's brain damage of some physical damage of something to their brain. So they just don't have that same, they're untrainable. You can't teach somebody conscious to be considerate to others if that part of their brain is physically broken. So what are you gonna do? Say to them, we're not gonna put you in jail, just go do whatever you want.
Yeah, I don't think it's just go do whatever you want. But I think it does come down to beliefs about what is humane and what do people deserve and what is the role of community, you know? So I think like in one sort of abolitionist vision, communities are like a strong, cohesive thing. They exist. They exist in ways that a lot of people don't know now or anymore. So, you know, one model would be that person who has this like really serious struggle to identify with empathy and the consequences of their action.
That's the word. That's the word.
Yeah. They're in the context of a community, like a community that knows them, that cares about them, and a community that is equipped with mental health resources. You know, it might, I guess, like, I honestly don't know. I don't know if that would look, I don't know about the idea of compassionate confinement. Honestly, I think most abolitionist organizations don't spend the majority of our time on questions about people that lack all empathy. I think some communities might decide that a type of compassionate confinement is the answer, but I honestly don't know. But I do think that a combination of something that is truly informed by mental health resource and knowledge, and compassion, and that is community led, is a better response than what we have right now. Yeah, that's a really good question.
We have a question from Joyce that I'll read. She asks, what is the Cahoots model in Eugene?
Yeah, so for a long time, Eugene has had an alternative crisis response system. So it's a system with people trained in emergency medical response and mental health. They respond to mental health crises in Eugene. And they typically don't come with police. And they, just nationally, they're like the main crisis model that keeps getting talked about because they have really good stats on the number of people they help, and also specifically on how few, if any, people that they intervene with are then called the cops on. So there's this idea that if we create these alternative crisis responses, that these are dangerous people, and it's like unsafe to send social workers and mental health responders to them. And Cahoots is not finding that to be the case. Portland has variations on this model, but they're ones that are that have to do with police collaborations. So for example, Portland has something called Project Respond, which I have close friends that work with Project Respond. And Project Respond is dispatched to oftentimes to accompany police. So send social workers out to accompany police, but the issue is that police are already there to begin with, and they're beginning their criminalization process. So Cahoots in Eugene, I think, is a really good, innovative example of how to separate from police in that response. Because one thing that's stressful, so as not just a social worker, but as a person, I've encountered situations that I have a feeling most people here have encountered, where like you're walking down the street, somebody seems like they're having a mental health episode, somebody is like falling down drunk, they're a stranger, you don't know them, and your gut is, well, let me call 911 because they need an ambulance, they need help. But then you also know, but cops will come. I don't know this person's story. What if they have a warrant out? Are they going to take them to jail instead of a hospital? But then you also feel like you don't have your own personal resources or answers. Like you're not going to bring someone home to sit on your couch. You might, but you might not. So Cahoots offers that alternative. And Cahoots is just one example that's in Oregon, but a lot of states are creating similar models that are giving me a lot of hope.
Okay, I think that's a good question to end on. Thank you so much, Sam, for a moving and informative presentation. Really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.